You're up.
And the Oscar goes to...
Here we go. This is
Godzilla.
After decades of being one of the most iconic cinematic franchises of all time, Godzilla has won an Oscar. Godzilla Minus One is rightfully being praised as one of the greatest Godzilla films in recent memory, if not ever.
Possibility of standing on this stage seemed out of reach.
With all franchises that last a long time, there's a tendency for new fans, enthusiastic about a quality entry in a series, to talk down about a franchise's goofier entries. We saw it with James Bond, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, just about every single horror movie franchise with more than 4 films, especially Friday the 13th. But it's especially true for Godzilla, which has multiple entries all coming out in short succession, all celebrating different aspects of Godzilla's legacy. And I mean that fairly recently. 2023 and 2024 have been the years of Godzilla, with some of the best releases we've seen in a very long time. Monarch, the multiple Godzilla shorts we've seen for the Godzilla Fest, Godzilla x Kong, and of course, Godzilla Minus One. But while Godzilla Minus One harkens back to the original film's darkness, something both Godzilla 2014 and Shin Godzilla did, the new Godzilla x Kong movie harkens back to the goofier side, the Showa era, the gigantic kaiju brawls, absurd sequences, and imaginative fantasy world building that defies all logic, other than the rule of cool. Before we get started, if you like what I do here, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me how you got introduced to Godzilla, what your favorite film is, and what kaiju is your favorite. For me personally, mine is Mothra, but let's celebrate these iconic kaiju together. He's been around for wait, hang on, when did actually the first film come out? 1954. That was 70 years ago. 1954, 2024. Wow. That just occurred to me. This is kind of a 70th anniversary of Godzilla video, I guess? I don't know. 70 years. I mean, that's a big deal. Alright. Now, when I grew up, Godzilla was one of those franchises that every kid adored, and myself included. I was introduced to Godzilla back during the Sci-Fi Channel marathons he used to run.
Welcome to Godzilla Incorporated Week. Each night this week, someone else invades my turf. And whether it's King Kong,
where they'd have a bunch of the classic Showa-era films running back to back to back. Maybe they'd have King Kong Escapes in there too, which was the King Kong kaiju film Toho did after Godzilla vs. King Kong, or King Kong vs. Godzilla. And they were a lot of fun.
Incorporated on the Sci-Fi Channel.
I think the first Godzilla film I saw was King Kong vs. Godzilla, but it might have also been Godzilla vs. Megalon. Which explains why I love Jet Jaguar so much. That's a great kaiju. And you know, we would watch them. They'd air back to back, and I wouldn't know when each film came out. I wouldn't know chronology. This is back when the internet was in its infancy. So you got to keep in mind, this was just running on Sci-Fi Channel, and we just watch them as they came out.
Godzilla is approaching. Evacuate immediately.
Sci-Fi Stumpathon 2001 continues today at 3 p.m. with Godzilla vs.
And they were a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun memories when I was a kid. My grandmother would watch me and just have these playing on all the way. I had all those Godzilla toys. I had Mecha Godzilla, I had Mecha King Ghidorah, which I didn't even know existed at the time. I just knew it was a cool looking figure. I had no idea what the context was, none of that. Just cool times. I always associate Godzilla, therefore, with childhood, with the fun of seeing these monsters on screen, more so than the original Godzilla film, which I actually saw not that often as a child. I saw that more as an adult, because I think the original Godzilla film's a masterpiece, but when you're watching as a kid, what are you gonna go towards? The slower, more unpleasant, the more serious, dramatic Godzilla film where Godzilla doesn't show up and fight any monsters, or we're gonna watch the film where Godzilla and a giant robot man fight a giant cockroach and a giant chicken with a chainsaw, with a buzzsaw for a chest. It's not a hard decision. Don't take too long to figure it out. I think a lot of fans now, though, are so caught up in the serious, Oscar-winning kaiju-sized metaphors that we're forgetting how inherently silly Godzilla is. Even going back to the first film, there is some goofiness there. It's a guy in a giant rubber... Well, actually, it was some ready-mixed cement, actually. People don't realize this. The original rubber suit was a mix of latex and cement. Imagine looking that around. At the end of the day, the original Godzilla is about a guy wearing a suit, walking around, crushing toy buildings and tanks. And despite what various, admittedly very effective, analog horror films or shorts on YouTube would like to tell you, it was just that, guy in a suit, for most of those old films. Back in the days when Godzilla came on screen, there were 3 ways to effectively bring monsters to life: rubber suits, puppetry, or stop motion. To this day, I'm unsure which was the more effective means of monster creation. I mean, personally, I'm always drawn to the artistry of stop motion. I look at the original King Kong or Mighty Joe Young or The Beast in 20,000 Fathoms, and I see some of the most beautiful monster effects of all time.
The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
And while puppets could be used, I don't think they really hit their stride until Jim Henson came along. We got stuff like Star Wars, The Dark Crystal, etc. So rubber suits, they were very goofy, but they were also cost-effective and very good at helping to lend to the scale of kaiju action. Here's another thing. Godzilla as an icon, that didn't happen overnight. The original Godzilla film was a hit, undeniably so, but The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms also had come out a couple years prior.
Buried somewhere under the polar ice cap, in a state of suspended animation, are the awesome creatures. A nuclear explosion can free one from his icy tomb.
When Godzilla Raids Again came out in America, it was named Gigantus, the Fire Monster, because American producer Paul Schreibman thought audiences might be confused, since the previous film ended with Godzilla being destroyed by the oxygen destroyer. I think he overestimated how many people would remember Godzilla was killed by the oxygen destroyer. And Godzilla Raids Again is fascinating, because it's the middle point between the formula that we would see in the Showa era and the darkness of the first film. I don't think it gets the best of either. I think Anguirus is an interesting ally for Godzilla, but not as interesting to watch Godzilla fight. But it did set the tone. Godzilla comes back, a new monster comes in, they fight, buildings get crushed, nebulous ending at, the monster's beaten, and Godzilla is either walks away or is temporarily imprisoned for a time being, what have you. But the original King Kong vs. Godzilla was in a lot of ways the start of Godzilla movies feeling like a WWE ticket match.
How do you like your monsters? Huge, warm-blooded, and furry?
King Kong?
Or ancient, destructive, and scaly?
Right down to having to get through a boring human story to get to the action.
The combination.
Look at them go.
Is explosive.
And even Godzilla fans can tell you that very few Godzilla movies have a compelling human narrative. That's something that a lot of the newer Godzilla films have worked with or against, and it depends on the effectiveness of the film to determine how interesting the human story is. Of the early Showa era films, I think the one that really got the human narrative, aside from the original film, is Mothra vs. Godzilla. Not to confuse with Godzilla vs. Mothra, which is the 1992 film, not the 1964 film. And both are peak. Both are peak Godzilla, in my opinion. Whenever Mothra comes on, you're gonna get a good story. Anytime Godzilla is on screen with Mothra, the film is elevated, and I think that's due to Mothra's inherent connection to humanity and human culture. Because of Mothra's ties to being worshipped as a goddess, the island culture from which she hails from, that inherently brings humanity into the core conflict of the narrative, rather than makes them something that we have to move past to get to the kaiju. It is part of the kaiju experience. Mothra's eggs wash up on shore in that first film, and people have a mix of reactions. Now, this is also a sequel, you have to keep in mind, to the film Mothra, so audiences in Japan already knew who Mothra was. Now, the eggs wash up, and businessmen exploit the eggs for an exhibit, as well as the two twin fairies who emerge as Mothra's protector. And there's a lot discussed here about how capitalism exploits both the wonders and horrors of nature. And King Kong Godzilla did this too with the television studio subplot of the film, but I think that Mothra versus Godzilla really hits the nail harder because it shows how people are exploited by businesses and their property and their territory and the cost of lives. Whereas King Kong versus Godzilla is more about filming spectacle, this is more about humanity taking hold of society. I think it's one of the last really deep plots that Godzilla films had before diving into Showa-era silliness, and that's fine. And of course we get multiple fights in Godzilla vs. Mothra. One where a moth and a giant radioactive reptile fight, and another where her two offspring come back for revenge. It's great. It's fantastic. Even in the Heisei era, which is the era of Godzilla films after the initial show. So the way the films work, there's the Showa era, which is, from 1954 to the mid-70s, where it's from Godzilla, the original, to, I think, one of the Mechagodzilla films, the second one. And the Heisei era came around, which was from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, and that's a stretch of like a film every year, and they played Godzilla a little more seriously, though still having some of the action from the original series. And it's all one big continuity, the films feed into the other, it's a good, solid run. Then there's the Millennium era, which is kind of a weird, fragmented era of Godzilla films. Each film kind of stands alone, except for a couple of the films which reference the first film, and there's a couple films here and there that, like, it's nebulous is what I'm getting at. And then there's the Heisei era, which is what we're in currently, which is Shin Godzilla, the Godzilla anime, and of course, the legendary film series. But Heisei is pretty beloved among fans for this run of serious Godzilla narratives, but they're of course very silly as well. While things were getting more serious and more dramatic and they're playing Godzilla for horror rather than just spectacle or fun, the films never forgot the core appeal of the Godzilla franchise: the monsters. A lot of fans don't have fond memories, though, of 1985's The Return of Godzilla, the spark of the Heisei saga, which harkened back to the original film in the same way later entries would. Godzilla is the solo monster, comes back, destroys stuff. The American release of The Return of Godzilla even brought Raymond Burr back as his character, Steve Martin. Yes, the character was named Steve Martin. Let's move on. When you talk about the Heisei era with fans, they're going to talk about films like Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Godzilla vs. Mothra, or if they have taste, Biolante's solo outing. But the first film feels hollow because it's just recreating the first Godzilla film, the first one from 1954. And I think it's because it lacked a real allegorical component to it. Godzilla walks through Japan, destroys things, but it doesn't mean as much as, say, Shin Godzilla does when dealing with the fallout of the 2011 tsunami, nor does it have as much to do with the meaning that Godzilla Minus One has when focusing back on the Japanese people uniting. There's a lack of depth to The Return of Godzilla that I think lends it to being somewhat forgotten as an entry. But ultimately, the core appeal for a while for Godzilla fans was seeing Godzilla fight other monsters. Consider this. When Godzilla decided to wrap up their Millennium era, they went out with a bang, Godzilla Final Wars, a tribute to what the fans wanted, what they believed the fans wanted at the time. And it's a movie that's purely just Godzilla brawling with every single kaiju they can squeeze into this runtime, even knocking the Americans' remake Zilla down in a curb stomp battle. It's non-stop excitement, and even the human narrative gives way to absurd action. But there's a reason why Final Wars isn't a fan favorite, though it has fan favorite moments. I think it's because Godzilla Final Wars gives fans too much of what they want, and because of that, it becomes a little mind-numbing at times. Not to mention the fact that Godzilla plows through everyone. Like, there's that scene where he's fighting King Caesar and Rodan, and he's just plowing through them like a WWE match. And it's not as fun as watching Godzilla struggle a little bit. He has to be a little of a back and forth. Godzilla's too OP in Final Wars, I think. Even though you get a lot of the fan service stuff in there, it's so much action, your brain kind of melts along the way. I think Godzilla's reappraisal as a solo monster that deserves respect from Western fans came with the Legendary series, but Hideaki Anno's Shin Godzilla truly is what reminded audiences that Godzilla can be frightening. He can be horrific. But even then, there's a Universal Studios ride where Godzilla fights the Evangelions. Like, yeah, that exists. It's a cool thing. And then they fight King Ghidorah at the end. It's lovely. I love it. As a fan of both franchises, especially Evangelion. I think one reason why a subset of Godzilla fans today misinterpret Godzilla as a purely serious thing in Japan is because for the last few years, Godzilla fans have been treated to a series of shorts where Godzilla fights his classic adversaries who haven't been on film for a while, all taking place in the Heisei continuity. We've seen Godzilla Jr. fight Gigan and Megalon, and we have a reunion match between Godzilla and Jet Jaguar, who to this day is still peak, but they're not being released as the big blockbusters in international markets. Audiences aren't seeing these fun shorts, though Godzilla fans are getting them in Japan, and they are being released on YouTube, and a lot of hardcore fans are watching them. The average fan who just watched Godzilla Minus One and is now introduced to Godzilla as a franchise, as a serious franchise, they don't see that Godzilla is still being celebrated for the inherent silliness of Godzilla. All they see is Godzilla is serious business now. They might have seen Shin Godzilla, they might have seen Godzilla Minus One, and maybe they've seen the Legendary films as well. But the hardcore Godzilla fans we're seeing online today that is new to the franchise, they don't seem to realize that a lot of longtime fans love the silly aspects of Godzilla. Even if it's goofy, even if it's absurd, the silliness, the brawls, that's what drew us in the first place, as kids.
Welcome to Godzilla Incorporated Week. I run this town.
But let's talk for a second about the American Legendary Pictures Godzilla, because the 2014 film harkens back to the seriousness of the original film. They treat Godzilla less as a monster or superhero and more as this defender of nature, this genuinely serious entity that maintains the balance between humanity's destructive forces, between forces outside of the world. He is Earth's protector, but he's not necessarily humanity's protector. Over time, we've seen, from 2014 to 2024, Godzilla has shifted. He has become this almost Lovecraftian entity of cosmic proportions to the Showa-era fun Godzilla. We've seen it. We've gone through the same cycle in roughly the same period of time that Japan went with Godzilla. Because again, King Kong vs. Godzilla, that was about 10 years after the first Godzilla film. A little less, actually. I think it was 62. So, within 8 years, much like we had with Legendary, Japan had a silly Godzilla. In just as few appearances. 3 films, he's silly again. In both. And now we're seeing that continue into the Showa, into our modern American Showa era of Godzilla films. And people are rejecting that because they want that serious Godzilla that they got from Godzilla Minus One, but they're forgetting the cycle. They're forgetting the pace at which Godzilla changes. And I think a lot has to do with the familiarity audiences have with Godzilla in a given point in time. In the Showa era, we were becoming more familiar with Godzilla for the first time, and children loved it. So they made Godzilla films that humanized Godzilla. If you watch Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, there's a great scene where Mothra has to argue with Godzilla and Rodan to get them to work together.
Mothra says the Earth belongs to them as much as it does to man.
And it's a great scene because you have the fairies translating because they can speak monster apparently. And Godzilla just unleashes a bunch of swears at one point.
Oh, Godzilla, what terrible language!
It's so goofy and so silly, but it's such a part of the appeal of Godzilla at that era. And we've never seen anything that silly before. We're seeing Godzilla and Kong communicate, but it's usually done through the dramatics of their, very expressive CGI models in these new films. We're not seeing a fairy translate when Godzilla decides to drop an F-bomb or say a slur about Rodan's mother or something. We are seeing, though, that same mentality, just reinterpreted through a different lens. It's fascinating watching American Godzilla follow the same cycle that Japanese Godzilla did, becoming increasingly more about the fun kaiju action than the existential horror these monsters represents, because the existential horror settles down.
Godzilla, huh? Okay, let me see what you're made of.
When all is said and done, what is the value in these films? What artistic merit do we get from watching monsters clobbering monsters? In some sense, there is something very profound about it. These kaiju were created to represent how dwarfed humanity was by the reality around them. Godzilla represents the fear of nuclear war, very obviously. Everyone knows that. But also the fear of out-of-control nuclear testing. Nagasaki and Hiroshima are just as influential on Godzilla as the nuclear testing on Bikini Atoll. Kong, however, represents the wrath of nature and the danger it posed, as well as humanity believing themselves the master of nature. That's our undoing, that we think we can dominate nature, but we can't. And that's always relevant, and Kong's limited appearances lend itself to that, because 30s, 70s, 2000s, different ways to interpret how we think we can dominate nature. But every kaiju represents something. The fear of the cosmos with Ghidorah, the worship of the old and natural with Mothra, the power of volcanic eruptions and the hurricane with Rodan. Every single monster is born of something, and we get to see these avatars of destruction go head to head. There's a reason no one cares about the destruction in cities in Godzilla films. There's a reason that people have fun with it, because it's all a set, it's all an artifice. And the artificiality of these sets is part of the fun, at least in the older films. Modern films, they play up the horror, but between the original Godzilla film and the Heisei era, and even the end of the Heisei era, these sets, these miniatures, they were fun because we can watch destruction take place without thinking about real devastation. There's a childlike charm to it, where kids just cling together action figures and don't have to worry about whether or not the chipped paint on the surface will diminish its value. Because, let's be obvious, you're not going to resell those figures, ever, because you're playing with them as kids. But it's also about us coming to terms with the expanse of things outside our control. These Godzilla films, not the action figures. I realize I'm getting a little sidetracked here. When Godzilla manages to lighten up, we are allowed to explore the sheer expanse of what Godzilla represents, and the other kaiju, and we're able to take hold of that fear. We're able to grapple with it, and side with it in some cases. For a moment, we're able to truly escape from a reality where the world is outside our control. And granted access to a world where everything is completely outside of control, but things still work out for us. Godzilla is on our side. Even though he is this representative of destruction and terror, he's our destruction and terror. And he's helping us stop the other forms of destruction and terror that are outside of our realm of control entirely. Or the consequences of our own hubris, you might say. And we can see some cool monsters fight. We get to see the force of the atom against the hurricane, against aliens, against chickens with buzzsaws coming out of their chests, against cockroaches. Honestly, Megalon is there's something to be said about the ideas of Megalon, a giant cockroach fighting the atomic age personified. There's a joke in there that cockroaches will survive the nuclear apocalypse of society. This is why kaiju films like Godzilla survive, while many of the other classic monster films outside of Toho's factory fade into obscurity. No one cares about the giant claw, because he doesn't fight another monster in his film. And he only looks like a big flying battleship. That's the only thing he's good for. Just flying around and looking as large as a battleship. It's something we've seen before. Outside of the Ray Harryhausen special effects for some of these monsters, a lot of them have faded into obscurity in pop culture, A, because they lack a shared universe and lore. Again, some films do this better than others. But also because They are monsters that humanity can ultimately defeat. And yes, Godzilla Minus One and Shin Godzilla both highlight humanity's capability to come together and stop a monster. But there's at least roadblocks that keep us from doing that. And not just the monster, but societal roadblocks. Difficulties within the government, difficulties coming together, finances, devastation, relying on other world superpowers. It's easier for us to stop a bad guy, though, in films where it's just the military comes in and shoots the monster and the day's saved. The Giant Claw ends with us beating the monster. The only threat is external, because those films were made to emphasize how humanity was already together, that human strength and ingenuity could stop anything. But Kaiju represents something different. Kaiju's classic brawls do not have the illusion that humanity is in control. Humanity stands little to no chance against Rodan, against Ghidorah, against Gigan, against Mechagodzilla, against Hedorah. We cannot stop them unless we create monsters of our own, as is the case with Mechagodzilla in the later Heisei films. If anything, humanity's attempts to stop Kaiju actually makes things worse. Destroyer is a creation of the original Oxygen Destroyer. It's like a weird mutation thing with Godzilla's genes and the genes in the ocean and all these microbial things coming to life as this great monster. In stopping Godzilla, we created a worse monster, one that destroys Godzilla ultimately. I think it's ultimately thematic that humanity beats Destroyer, because Destroyer is really humanity's complete mess, and we clean it up. Godzilla is ultimately destroyed, and humanity contains Godzilla's explosive force. Humanity stops Destroyer. The end of the Heisei era is humanity finally taking control of our fate and destiny. And it's done in a very silly movie where Godzilla's heart's about to explode and blow up the planet. And fights literal Satan. Fights Kaiju Satan, essentially. And that's not the only time the Heisei era discussed humanity's influence on nature.
Just look at that. It'll ruin our future.
In Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, we see a World War II soldier who felt that Godzilla, who he encountered during the war prior to his transformation into a kaiju, he believes he has a special kinship with Godzilla. He feels a connection to him. And so later on in the film, they're reunited, and Godzilla just blows him up. No hesitation, just bombardment. And then he moves on. Human life means nothing to this titanic force. And yet, the film also emphasizes how humanity can beat Godzilla in multiple ways. The main conflict of the film are these time travelers who come back in time from the future, and they stop Godzilla by preventing his birth. Don't think too hard about the time travel mechanics in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. It's very flaky and weird. So in stopping Godzilla, they create King Ghidorah. And due to time travel shenanigans, they figure out a way to bring back Godzilla, but also King Ghidorah is still here. And so they fight. And when King Ghidorah is beaten by Godzilla, they now realize, oh wait, we still have to deal with Godzilla, and somehow he's stronger than ever. So by interfering with time travel and trying to stop all this stuff, Godzilla comes back stronger and angrier than ever before. So to stop Godzilla, they bring back King Ghidorah as Mecha King Ghidorah, which is again that little figure I loved as a kid. I didn't know what it was. I didn't realize it was humanity reclaiming their own errors to stop this monster. And the cool thing is, they win. Yes, it's always a running gag in Godzilla films that the military can't stop Godzilla, but in the King Ghidorah film in the Heisei era, humanity does beat Godzilla. Yes, they make several mistakes along the way, and yes, it's a plot from the future people versus the people from the present. It's a whole weird sci-fi Terminator 2 inspired plot. But at the end of the day, humanity reclaims their mistakes, fights Godzilla in a cool fight, and ultimately wins. And it's a great movie. It's so much fun. It's so fun to see humanity reclaim the mechanisms by which we are out of control in order to fight. And it's a cool monster design too. That's the fun of it also. There is some thematic depth that's as subtle as a brick to the face, but the fun of it is watching giant monsters fight. And of course, there's other films in the Heisei era that deal with similar themes, like Biollante, who is a combination of Godzilla, a rose, and the soul of a forsaken child, which is just bizarre, and I love it. And it's grotesque and monstrous and fantastic. And it's hammy, and it has not a subtle bone in its body, but it's so much fun. It's so fun. And the monster designs are out of control and illogical. It makes no sense. If you think about it for more than 5 seconds, the logic breaks down, but it's so much fun to watch. And in the Showa era, just forget it. Humanity is never at fault after the initial Godzilla films. Like the first few films, yeah, capitalism with Mothra and King Kong versus Godzilla, that's the problem. But then it becomes aliens. It's always aliens. Aliens this, subterranean mole people that, Planet of the Apes rejects this. And as is the case in Godzilla vs. Megalon, which again, one of the introductory films I saw and owned on VHS, and yes, it was the VHS where they're standing on top of the World Trade Centers, even though it makes no logical sense, never happens in the film. The mole people call up the aliens and say, hey, we're getting our butts beaten. Can we borrow Gigan? And it's like, yeah, sure, have Gigan. Here, come on over. Bring Gigan over. It's great. It's so silly. And in the big crossover film, essentially, Destroy All Monsters, the aliens come down and mind control all the monsters, and they're just wrecking havoc everywhere. And the movie is like 80 minutes of boring garbage and then 10 minutes of great kaiju action. But that 10 minutes is like the Avengers event of the 60s. You got them all together, all ganging up on King Ghidorah, who just gets curb stomped in the most unfair fight of all time. And everyone does a little thing, even like Godzilla Jr. Manila. He gets a couple smoke rings around Ghidorah's neck, and it's like cool. And it's the canonical end of the Showa era. A big brawl between monsters. And it's dumb, and it's goofy, and it's so much fun. It is just a joy to watch. And you're not thinking of anything deeper because it's, who cares? It's aliens. There's no theme. There's no idea. It's just a bunch of people in a WWE wrestling match ganging up on one bad guy who's been just the worst for this entire saga. It's fantastic. Godzilla is a representative of mankind's nuclear hubris, and he saves the day. And he makes friends. And they even make an island where all the monsters can hang out together. It becomes the optimism of the human race, where we can live with these destructive forces, where we can experience the consequences of our actions and then continue, and then survive, and then persevere. Because even though we're living with these destructive, horrible forces that can destroy us in an instant, we are still able to coexist between both the natural world and the world that we create. The Showa era has this theme to it of surviving with destruction. Not in opposed to destruction, but in balance with it. And when we do something that's really bad, like an alien comes by, we let them take over the world, or we pollute too much, the natural world, or maybe in this case, the nuclear powers that we've created, can stop it. Godzilla destroys pollution. That's pretty cool. You know, it's that kind of dream. It's that kind of solar punk aesthetic, except it's kaiju action. Don't read too much into the Showa films. They're very silly. But that theme of humanity surviving alongside ancient and recent monsters and continuing to persevere is a beautiful message. The cheesy Godzilla films are not without messages. They clearly have a lot of themes to them, but they're just so over the top and glorious. There isn't a subtle bone in the Showa era Godzilla's body, and that's great. With these new films coming out, I hope they harken back to the fun that these old films had, because there is so much joy in classic Godzilla. There's so much fun to it that I think a lot of people are neglecting. They're sleeping on it because they want the serious, dramatic, Oscar-winning films. But the fact remains that you can have your silliness, you can have your goofiness, and you can have seriousness, because you're coexisting with both the destructive forces of nature and just the sheer fun of giant monsters. It is all the fun of going into your toy box and taking out figures of characters you don't really know, but you've created this whole backstory in your head about. And you're clinging them together, and you're knocking down cardboard buildings. Showa-era Godzilla harkens back to the true childhood a lot of us had. Even if they're destructive, even if there's violence there, even if the themes are representative of these bigger world powers beyond our understanding, they bottle it down to fun little avatars.